Picture an ice sculpture of a Greek god, 6 feet tall, carved from a single block, standing at the center of a party on a private island in the Mediterranean. Vodka pours from where the wine should be. 75 guests watch it melt, drink in hand, laughing. You're looking at the most expensive party ever thrown by a single family. $2 million. 1 week, one island, and somewhere in that crowd, holding a glass, wearing a grin he'd spend the next decade trying to wipe off his face, stands the man who is about to become one of the most famous white-collar criminals in American history. He didn't know it yet, but this party, his wife's birthday, his masterpiece, his proudest night, is the exact moment his empire started dying. Not because anyone caught him that night, because of what the party revealed about a man who had already stopped being able to tell the difference between his money and everyone else's. This is the story of Dennis Kozlowski. And this is the story of the most expensive mistake in corporate history. Before we get into it, if stories like this are your thing, subscribe to Billion Dollar Chronicles because this channel is built entirely around cases exactly like this one. And drop a comment telling me what you would have done differently in his position. By 2001, Dennis Kozlowski ran one of the most powerful companies most people had never heard of, Tyco International, a conglomerate that made fire alarms, surgical tools, electronic components, security systems, the invisible infrastructure behind 100 industries in 100 countries. Under Kozlowski, it grew into a nearly $40 billion giant. Wall Street loved him. Business magazines put him on their covers. He was one of the highest paid executives in the country, earning more in 3 years than most people earn in 10 lifetimes. On paper, he was a legend. A kid from Newark who worked his way up from an entry-level auditor to the corner office. A self-made man in a world of trust fund executives. And that story, the outsider who clawed his way to the top, was real, at least at the start. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. The company Kozlowski built stopped being something he managed and started becoming something he owned in his mind, even though legally it belonged to shareholders. Every acquisition made him more powerful. Every year of rising stock made him more untouchable. And every untouchable year made the next shortcut a little easier to justify. By the time his wife's 40th birthday came around, Kozlowski wasn't just running a company. He was running a private kingdom, funded by other people's money, and he had convinced himself he'd earned the right to spend it however he wanted. Look at the math of his own compensation, and you can start to see the warp taking hold. Across just 3 years, he pulled in something close to $267 million in pay. Not company value created, not shareholder return delivered. Personal pay stacked so high that ordinary numbers stopped meaning anything to him. When your own paycheck reaches 9 figures, a $2 million birthday party doesn't register as excess. It registers as Tuesday. That's the trap sitting underneath every story like this one. Wealth doesn't just buy things. It buys a new scale. And once your internal scale resets high enough, the line between generous and reckless, between rewarded and stolen, quietly disappears. Here's what almost nobody understood at the time, including the board that was supposed to be watching him. The party wasn't the crime. The party was just the first time the crime became visible. For years before Sardinia, Kozlowski had been moving money out of Tyco through channels so boring, so buried in technical language, that nobody thought to question them. Loan programs meant for relocating employees, quietly used to fund personal real estate. Bonuses authorized by a compensation committee that rarely asked hard questions. Loans taken out and then forgiven again and again, turning debt into disguised income that never had to be reported the way a salary would. None of it looked like theft. It looked like paperwork. And paperwork is exactly where people stop paying attention. A stolen painting draws a crowd. A forgiven loan on page 40 of a filing draws nothing at all. This is the real hidden cause behind Kozlowski's downfall. And it's the same cause behind almost every major fraud in corporate history. The theft doesn't start with a dramatic heist. It starts with access. Access to systems boring enough that no one audits them closely, run by a man senior enough that no one questions him twice. Give a person unchecked access in enough time, and the line between creative compensation and criminal extraction doesn't get crossed all at once. It erodes, quietly, one comfortable justification at a time, until the person doing it can no longer see the line at all. There's also a structural piece that made it worse. A board that trusts its CEO, a compensation committee that defers to him, and a culture where nobody wants to be the one person asking uncomfortable questions of the man who just delivered another record quarter. Kozlowski didn't need to defeat Tyco's oversight. He just needed that oversight to stay comfortable, distracted, and slightly too impressed with him to look closely. For years, it did exactly that. And underneath the systems and the boardrooms was something simpler and more human. A man who had once been an outsider, clawing his way up, now sat at the very top, surrounded by people who owed their careers to him, agreed with him, and rarely told him no. Power like that doesn't just remove oversight from the outside. It slowly removes the instinct to police yourself from the inside. There's a principle hiding inside this story that applies to far more than one CEO on one island. Call it the visibility tax. Every dollar you take that isn't yours carries a hidden cost, and that cost isn't paid when you take it. It's paid the moment it becomes visible. Money moved quietly through boring channels can hide for years. But the same money, once it buys something loud, a party, a mansion, a piece of art hanging on a wall where people can see it, starts paying interest on every year it stayed hidden. The longer the concealment, the higher the tax when the visibility finally comes due. Kozlowski could hide hundreds of millions of dollars inside loan programs and compensation structures almost indefinitely. Nobody outside his inner circle understood those mechanisms well enough to question them. But he could not hide a private concert. He could not hide 75 guests, a professional videographer, and an ice sculpture urinating vodka on camera. The tragedy of the visibility tax is that the people who owe it rarely see it coming, because for years, hiding has worked perfectly. Success at concealment doesn't feel like a countdown. It feels like proof you've gotten away with it. And that false sense of safety is exactly what makes people spin louder, not quieter, the longer they go unchallenged. To understand exactly how the fall happened, you need to see the two phases that every hidden fraud eventually passes through. Call the first phase the quiet extraction and the second phase the camouflage ceiling. During the quiet extraction, everything stays technical. Loans get issued and quietly forgiven. Bonuses get authorized through committees that trust the CEO's judgment more than they should. Company funds get labeled as business expenses when they aren't. Nothing about this phase looks dramatic. It looks like ordinary corporate machinery, and that's precisely the point. The goal of the quiet extraction isn't secrecy through hiding. It's secrecy through boredom. Nobody investigates what nobody finds interesting. But every person operating this way eventually hits the camouflage ceiling, the point where their lifestyle grows so large that it can no longer be disguised as ordinary business, no matter how the paperwork is labeled. Kozlowski's birthday party was filed internally as a shareholder meeting. On paper, half the $2 million cost was a legitimate corporate expense. In reality, it was gladiators at the door, togas by the pool, and $250,000 flown in to have a musician sing at a swimming party. No label survives contact with an ice sculpture like that. The moment something is that visible, it stops being deniable, even if the invoice says otherwise. And here is the mechanism that actually destroyed him. Investigators had already begun circling Tyco over an entirely separate matter. Millions of dollars in fine art, quietly shipped to avoid New York sales tax. That threat alone might have stayed a tax case. But once regulators started pulling on it, the loan programs, the forgiven debts, the hidden bonuses, the entire architecture of the quiet extraction came into the light at the same time. And when prosecutors needed to show a jury exactly who this man was, they didn't reach for a spreadsheet. They played the videotape. Jurors who might have struggled to parse compensation committee minutes had no trouble at all understanding a 6-foot ice sculpture pouring vodka out of an anatomically correct statue, paid for in part with shareholder money. The camouflage ceiling is what turns a fraud case into a story. And a story is what convicts you in the court of public opinion long before a jury ever reaches a verdict. You don't need to run a $40 billion company to fall into this same trap. The visibility tax applies at every scale. If you're building a business, a brand, or simply a life, ask yourself a harder question than "Can I get away with this?" Ask instead, what happens the day this becomes visible to everyone, not just the people I've chosen to show it to? Every shortcut you take, in how you report numbers, how you treat people who trusted you, how you represent what you've built, accumulates a hidden tax that compounds in silence and comes due all at once, usually at the worst possible moment. The lesson isn't paranoia, it's design. Build the parts of your life and your business so that they can survive full visibility, not just partial visibility. Structure your finances the way you'd want them to look if a stranger read every line. Treat your team the way you'd want to describe by someone who owed you nothing. Not because you'll definitely get caught if you don't, plenty of people never do, but because the version of you that only functions in the dark is a version that's always one video, one leak, one curious auditor away from collapse. The safest wealth, the safest reputation, the safest empire is the one that was never built on something that needed to stay hidden in the first place. That's true whether you're negotiating a salary, pricing a product, or explaining a decision to someone who trusted you with their money. 3 questions do more work than any compliance manual ever will. Would this survive being read aloud by someone who dislikes you? Would this survive being explained to the person it actually affects? Would this survive being filmed? If the honest answer to any of those is no, you haven't found a shortcut. You found a countdown. Somewhere between the entry-level auditor from Newark and the man toasting his wife under an ice sculpture, Kozlowski stopped being someone who managed other people's trust and became someone who spent it like it was his own. That shift didn't happen at the party. The party was just the first moment the shift became impossible to hide. The identity worth building isn't the one that looks flawless on a highlight reel filmed on your best night. It's the one that would hold up if every quiet decision you made for the last 10 years was suddenly played back in a courtroom, in front of strangers, with no context and no mercy. That's a much higher bar than "don't get caught." It's the bar of becoming someone whose private ledger and public image were never two different documents to begin with. The people who build empires that last aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who never needed 2 separate versions of themselves. One for the shareholders and one for the ice sculptures. The ice sculpture melted before the sun came up. The guests flew home. The videotape got archived in a production company's storage, forgotten, waiting. 2 years later, that same footage played in a Manhattan courtroom in front of 12 strangers who would decide the rest of Dennis Kozlowski's life. Not the spreadsheets, not the loan agreements, the party, the gladiators, the vodka. 21 minutes of a man who thought he was untouchable, captured on his own camera, at his own request. At the exact moment he had the least idea, he was building the evidence that would send him away for the better part of a decade. He was sentenced to serve up to 25 years. He'd spend the next several of them thinking about a single week in Sardinia, the most expensive party in history, and the exact moment his empire started to melt, just like the ice. Every empire in this series falls or rises for the same reason. Not luck, not talent alone. A decision made quietly that eventually gets paid for in public. If you want to hear more stories like this, the frauds, the feuds, the fortunes built and lost in a single night, subscribe to $1 Billion Chronicles. New episodes go up regularly, and each one comes with a lesson you can actually use. Let me know in the comments which billionaire's downfall you want covered next, and I'll see you in the next one.